they can be for our patients. And you learned that it's not just one uniform way of doing this, right? We have, we have to make increases and decreases in technique, away from average. And increases need to be made with KVP changes. Decreases are made with mass changes, right? Let me just briefly pause. That's what we teach out of the textbook, okay? However, most X-ray techs are still making increased changes with mass. Basically, we're making all of our changes by changing mass, not changing KVP. It's a less common thing because digital radiography, although it's been around for quite a while, is still sort of a new concept in a lot of X-ray techs' minds, because a lot of X-ray techs, including myself, were trained with film. And one thing that you need to learn about film radiography is you have to leave the KVP alone. Okay, whatever the KVP is for your image that you're shooting, like a chest X-ray, you can't be messing with it. If you change the KVP, it'll drastically change the contrast of your image, right? The black and gray, right? The gray scale of your image gets changed a lot by changing KVP. Where that is just not the case with digital. Digital, we can make all these KVP and MAS changes and have them not change contrast on our image, because that's done by the computer. Okay, with film radiography, all of the contrast adjustment was done with KVP, so you had to leave KVP alone. You had to change with mass. A lot of X-ray techs were trained like that, and even if you're not trained, even if you personally weren't trained on film, most of the people who train you were trained a while ago, so on film usually. So we have this sort of outdated way of thinking that still is going through the field, and we've got to try to train that out of ourselves. So it's one thing we're trying to get across here, is it's better for the patients. Okay, our computers are very powerful, and they can do a lot, and they're not dependent on exactly the settings we make on the console. Okay, those settings we make on the console are now basically independent of the image properties. So it's different. It's different than it used to be. Let's move on. This second section here talks about generators and filtration. I'm not going to say too much. On the key terms page, I gave you an explanation of generators and filtration as easily as I could, but let me just say what they say. High-powered generators bring a net savings in patient exposure for an equivalent technique. If you've been with me through long enough, through equipment operation, you learned about the different types of X-ray generators, the things that produce the power to make the X-rays. And you learned that there are less efficient and more efficient kinds. The more efficient kinds, well, they make their X-rays more efficiently, okay, with less wasted energy, with more accurate settings, and it does actually decrease patient exposures to have a better, more high-powered, more efficient generator. Again, it's the thing that creates the power for the X-rays. Filtration is done by placing slabs of aluminum in between where the X-ray beam exits and the patient. Okay, so it's in the X-ray tube, it's in the X-ray machine, and basically what they'll do is they filter out the low energy, unuseful X-rays and just stop them from reaching the patient. If you can stop something from reaching the patient, that lowers patient exposure. Okay, so generators and filters are a way of optimizing things, but they're not like KVP and mass, where you can just change them with every exam. You're not plugging numbers into your control console. These are built into the equipment. Okay, so you don't go about changing these. Now, one room versus another, like our room here versus the rooms at your offices, those are going to be different, right? They'll have different generators, different filtration, but you're not changing them within any one exam. Next thing that can be done to affect patient exposure is called field size limitation. There's an area that the X-ray beam is, and we can make that area bigger or smaller. We call the device that does that a collimator, and we call the act of doing it collimation. The oldest style collimators were like this, just a tube, okay, attached to the X-ray machine, and basically they confine the X-ray beam to just the inside of that tube. Okay, what does this look a lot like?
Okay.
Yeah, but in radiography, the types of X-rays you've had before. Oh, like a dental X-ray thing, right? We put that tube up to your face. That's what it is. Okay. Modern day collimators look like this. I'll pass this one around if you haven't had it in your hands before. But basically, this attaches to the bottom of an X-ray machine. The X-ray beam has to come through this area here and pass through in between two sets of lead strips that you can adjust the width of. Okay, so I'll just set this down and let you guys take a look at that as you need to. That field size limiter, the collimator, allows us to adjust the amount of area that we're letting the radiation out in. Okay, so we can decrease the amount of body part that we're X-raying. We can only expose the body that we want. Only expose the area of the body that's important, right? So for like a hand X-ray, you don't want to expose the entire forearm, right? You want to stop that radiation field just past where the radius and ulna begin. Okay, decreasing your field size. The inclusion of nearby organs within the primary X-ray beam makes a 100-fold difference in dose to those organs. The area inside versus outside of your collimated field is about 100 times different. So 100 times more exposure inside the collimated field than outside of it. Now, there is such a thing as over-collimating too tightly to the body part and missing anatomy. For example, this is a good example actually. This humerus X-ray here, they've missed the bottom of the humerus, okay? Now you can see like the size of the film here, but you can also see that there's this black rectangle. That black rectangle is, inside of that was the radiation field, and outside of that was the outside of the radiation field. And you can see the film didn't get exposed out here, but did get exposed in here, okay? And down here they over-collimated, they collimated too tightly at the bottom, and they missed the bottom of the humerus. They would have to then repeat that exposure, doubling the patient's exposure. So over-collimating is just as bad, maybe even worse, than leaving the collimated field too far open. Okay. Proper collimation is the most effective means the radiographer can use to limit radiation exposure to our patients. Good collimation.
So if you're shooting your hand,
yeah, anatomy of interest, right? Exactly. So that's what we want to remember, is that there, for every exam, there's what we call the anatomy of interest, and we want to make sure the anatomy of interest is inside of our collimated field, and just everything else is outside of that. Okay? Good. Also, the light that your collimator turns on with, it projects a light down to the table, that light is not exactly where the radiation field will be. Those two things are just offset a little bit, okay? It's not going to be any more than about 3/4 of an inch, okay? But it can be up to about 3/4 of an inch, which is, it's a measurable amount, right? So we always like to leave a little bit of extra wiggle room around our body parts, maybe an inch of extra light around the body parts. Patient status matters. Patient status refers to the status of your patient. Thicker body parts, denser body parts, those kind of things require higher exposures. In fluoroscopy, something we don't do in plain film, but in fluoroscopy, we use compression sometimes. We actually take a big fancy paddle and we push and smush down a body part to make it thinner, to lower the exposure to that body part. Now it makes the body part a little denser, but it does kind of push tissues out of the way and actually can lower exposure. It's kind of, and improve image quality too. Remember there's a relationship between the thickness of the body part and the amount of scatter it produces, right? So if you can smush the body part down real flat, you can sort of push things out of the way and you can make it thinner and less scattered, better image quality. Mammogram's a good example of compression. Yeah, they take the breast and they squish it, right? Good. There are different reasons too. There's other reasons why they do the squishing, but same idea. Yeah. Grids and image receptors. Grids are devices to catch and stop scattered radiation from reaching our image receptor. Our image receptor is the thing that captures the image. It converts the X-ray beam into a latent image and then processes it. Minimum grid ratios should be used to provide sufficient cleanup of scatter. Remember, the grids use something called a grid ratio, the ratio of how high the little lead strips are to how far they are apart. Yeah. Higher grid ratios, like there's grid ratios of 8-to-1, 10-to-1, 12-to-1, 16-to-1. The higher that number is, the bigger that number is, the more effective the grid is at cleaning up scatter, but also the more exposure the patient will end up needing. So there's a relationship between grids and patient exposure. The greater the overall efficiency of the image receptor system is, the less technique that's required, and the more the patient exposure is saved. So you want good image receptors. Most of our digital image receptors now are super highly sensitive, so they're about as good as they can get. All right, let's move on. Yeah, I have not had that yet. So one good advice with our battery-powered cassettes is keep an eye on the battery charge and replace them when they get to 20%. Okay. Also, in like, for example, with ours, you know how you can open up an exam and have the exam open and be shooting images, right? But you can also not have an exam open, yeah? But the cassette can be on either way, right? If you're open, specific to equipment like ours, if your exam is open and the cassette's turned on, it's actively using the cassette and running down the battery power. It's like leaving the screen on your phone, right? If you're taken out of the exam, if you pause the exam and leave the cassette on, the cassette goes into sleep mode. So it conserves battery power. So you want to make sure your cassette runs for all day long. Try not to bring up your exams and open them up until you're ready to shoot the images. It'll conserve battery power for you in most of these battery-powered cassette situations. But yeah, and replace the batteries when they get to 20% or not much lower than that, because then you risk it dying.
I noticed because at urgent care, I had a couple. It was piling up.
Yeah.
X-rays. I was just thinking about speed. I was like, oh, let me do that. And next thing you know, I shot it, battery.
And then it just died. Yeah, because you're trying to jam through your exams. Yeah.
45 minutes. I'm like, oh, and then I was getting piled up.
You have extra batteries though, right?
You do, but the other battery doesn't work. So he's trying to replace that one. He's only giving me this one. So.
Oh, that's rough. So yeah, you really have to figure out making sure it stays charged on the downtime.
Where it's like he wants me to fail, make those mistakes, and then come to him. That's what I'm
But yeah, so that's a new-ish issue, right? Most of our image receptors now are wireless, battery powered, and that makes problems with batteries because batteries run out. So having extra batteries, making sure they stay charged, making sure that they're not like left dead overnight and like not charged in the morning, that's terrible, right? All of that matters, and so you got to keep an eye on those things. You always had to keep an eye on stuff, right? This is just a different thing to keep an eye on now, right? So it's sort of like with your phones, making sure they don't run out. Because you don't want to be the one who, sorry, doctor, we can't take x-rays because I forgot to charge the battery, right? That's never a good look. So, make sure they have an extra battery too. Like if they can afford it, they should have an extra battery or two, right?
So
Yeah, come on. Okay. Digital processing speed class. I don't want to say too much here, but the highest speed class, which does not present an unacceptable level of model, should be selected. Some procedures allow for more model. Model is graininess. Graininess comes from underexposure. The speed class of your cassette basically tells you how fast the cassette will expose. Okay? A fast speed cassette will expose very quickly. A low speed cassette exposes slowly, needs more exposure to get it needs more X-ray to get the exposure happening. This is a relic from film radiography where all of our films had an associated speed class and you had to choose the right speed film. Now our cassettes that we have, our image receptors are just uniform. You don't change your speed with your image receptor. So almost don't have to worry about it. Exposure indicators, such as an S number, a Q number, an exposure deviation number. These come up with every image you take. Every image you take, it tells you, were you above, below, or right at the targeted exposure level? So you get this on screen with your image, right? Regularly monitor these to make sure the technical settings that you're making on your equipment are not well above what the target exposures are, or well below what the target exposures are. You're trying to make sure that the target exposure, the exposure you'd like to get, is actually what you're getting, right? The only way to really know that is by looking at the exposure indicator that comes on screen with every new image that you get, okay? And you'll have to learn which one it is because every manufacturer gets to make their own exposure indicator number. Again, I mentioned some S and Q numbers, EI number, exposure deviation number. They're all different. You have to learn your manufacturer. Radiographic positioning is an important thing because repeat exposures for minor corrections should be discouraged, but repeat exposures for major corrections need to be considered. Like if you really, really mispositioned somebody, you got to repeat the image, right? Positioning matters a lot. And in fact, all of this stuff that we're talking about, it's important and all that, but honestly, when you're hands-on with your patients, the most important thing, and you guys are shaking your heads yes because you've had this, it's positioning, right? Positioning your patients is one of, if not the most important thing for your exams, right? Making sure they're in the right position to get the image that you're getting. Otherwise, everything else doesn't matter, right? You're not going to get anything done until you get the right position for your patient. So being good at positioning is a huge part of being a good x-ray tech. We'll do entire modules on positioning if you haven't had them with me yet. Okay. Increasing SID. SID is your source to image distance. It's the distance from where the x-rays happen inside of the x-ray tube all the way down to the image receptor. We standardize this distance to roughly 40 or 72 inches, right? But changing this distance has a huge effect on patient exposure. If you leave everything else alone, increasing your distance lowers patient exposure by a lot, okay? To use the wording from the inverse square law, doubling the distance would decrease the exposure by a factor of 4. So it doesn't cut it in half, right? You would think that doubling the distance would cut exposure in half, but it actually cuts it by 4 times less, not half as much, okay? Cutting the distance in half increases the exposure 4 times. So exposure changes by a lot with distance changes. This is a law called the inverse square law. If you haven't seen it yet, you'll see it a lot when we get into physics. Okay. Increasing SID reduces patient dose. That's good, but you often have to increase exposure to counteract the increase in SID. One thing that is useful though with SID is increasing SID to expand your field of view. As you back away, as you back the source of radiation away, the thing you see looks smaller and smaller and smaller. You can do this with a flashlight, right? You can take a flashlight, make a shadow of your hand on the wall, move your flashlight hand away from the shadowed hand, and you'll see the shadow on the wall get smaller, smaller, and smaller. Okay. Yeah, so let's see. Increasing SID approximately 2 centimeters to lengthwise field of view for every 25 centimeters added SID. Basically, now what you'll notice here, like if you look, we don't care what the actual distances are, but if you look at this one on the left, actually it says it good. If you look at this one on the left, right, 40-inch SID, notice part of the hip is just included, right? It's cut off. Now go over to the 72-inch SID. Notice how you can see the entire hip and pelvis, right? It's just because they backed away, the body part appears smaller now, okay? And if it didn't really click with what I was saying, right? It's just this, right? You have your flashlight, you have your shadow of the body part. Notice there's a relationship between where my hand is to the board and the sides of my shadow, right? But if I leave my hand at a fixed distance and then move my source away, notice the hand gets smaller and smaller, right? And as I move my source closer and closer, the hand gets bigger and bigger, right? So this would be the source of radiation, and increasing this distance from this to the image, right, changes the apparent size of that body part, okay? Source to image distance has a big effect on our image qualities, and not just the exposure numbers. The last thing here is AEC. AEC stands for Automated Exposure Control. It's one option of X-ray imaging system. Automated exposure control basically uses fancy electronics to control the exposure your patients receive, making it so you don't have to set the amount of radiation they receive. The computer sets it in real time. It stops the exposure when they've reached enough. Okay. AEC requires the application of certain optimum technique factors, proper collimation, accurate positioning, but it is one of the options for limiting patient dose because the computer's smarter than we are. Okay, the computer knows when to shut off the dose way better than we can program a dose, right? We can program a dose of radiation by setting a mass in a KVP. The computer can do it in real time, right? Can shut it off right when it's received the right amount. AEC is fantastic. It's just another tool though, right? And tools like any tool, this tool like any tool, can be misused, right? So you can misuse it by using poor collimation, poor positioning, and you can misuse the tool, okay? As well as making other incorrect settings with AEC. We don't use AEC at the school because I like to train you guys manually first, so you know how to like operate the equipment and then go out and use the automatic stuff. But you may see AEC out in your clinical settings. Does anyone have it? Does anyone use it? You guys have it?
It's easier, but you still have to make some adjustments.
You have to make some adjustments.
Especially when you do a pelvis in a 10-year-old female compared to a guy that's
Right.
rocking a pelvis. Yeah, you do have to make some adjustments.
What do you think about, how about accuracy for positioning? Do you have to be any more accurate or different? You have to position differently?
Especially, Clarissa, she's super specific on positioning, pretty much like calling everything. She's super like.
You have to be much more accurate with your centering, right? Because the AEC relies on something called a ion chamber, a detector chamber, right? And you have to put the body part over the detector chamber so that the machine can have the X-rays go through the body part, reach the detecting chamber, and the chamber can shut off the exposure when it's supposed to. If you misalign those two things, the computer will either shut off too quickly or too slowly, okay, and not give the right exposure. So it's much more, much less wiggle room for error, much less error room, I guess we would say. Yeah, so that's good. Last one is quality control and half value layers. All I really want to say here is that quality control programs helped detect trends toward poor images and excessive patient exposure. This is stuff like your quarterly X-ray, quarterly repeat review, right? That the radiation safety officers will go through and they'll basically look and make sure everyone's repeating images for good reasons and that our images are of good quality, right? This is important to do, quality control on a regular basis. And then half value layer refers to basically the intensity of the X-ray beam, and this is closely monitored by the people that service your equipment, making sure that your beam is not being overly penetrating. X-ray, you might think that an X-ray machine would get less and less effective over time. They actually get more and more effective over time. The machines produce a more and more penetrating beam as they age. So it's sort of the opposite of what you would expect. So we got to keep an eye on that. Half value layer is the number they use to evaluate that. All right.